Break flag.
Oh, all right.
There's only love.
You ready to roll?
from the stage.
Ready to roll?
Yep.
Thank you. Ooh, I forgot to bring that. Would you? This is your pen. I don't want to forget to give it to you. Do you have pockets?
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. Uh, I'm Lyda DeBin. I'm the executive director here at the Center for Fiction. So, welcome. How many of you are joining us for the first time? Is there a show of hands? Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for coming out. If you don't know, the Center for Fiction is a 200-year-old cultural arts nonprofit, and our mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and to support and celebrate its creation and enjoyment. So we do this work through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. Our Kids Read program offers immersive reading experiences for children, and we support early career writers with our first novel prize and our Emerging Writers Fellowship. So visit the site, sign up for our mailing list, follow us on social media. To support the work creating a home for readers and writers, please consider becoming a member so you're tuned in to all of our activities and come back and see us soon. For example, on November the 19th, we'll welcome author Robert Jones Jr., author of The Prophets, and Yadon Israel, senior editor and Simon and Schuster, no, senior editor, Simon and Schuster, and literary community builder to the center for our second Baldwin Centennial panel, The Evidence of Things Unseen, Baldwin, Faith, and Fiction. So tonight, please stay after the panel, grab a drink from the bar, browse the bookstore, make yourselves at home. I also want to offer a big thanks to Nicholas Boggs, who brainstormed the foundation for this panel with our Senior Director of Public Programs, Melanie McNair. It is impossible, of course, to cover the full legacy of James Baldwin in 1 hour, so we're excited to focus on the women in his work for tonight's event. Also, tonight is a Brooklyn Book Festival bookend event and part of the Downtown Brooklyn Arts Festival. So thank you so much to all of our partners. So without further ado, let's welcome tonight's panelists. Joining us via Zoom is Honorée Jeffers, a 2021 finalist for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize for her book, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. With us in person are Regina Porter, author of The Rich People Have Gone Away, Shayla Laws, author of Speculation, Francesca Monplaisir, author of My Mother's House. Francesca will also be our moderator, and Kim Coleman Foote, a 2018 Center for Fiction Emerging Writer Fellow and author of Coleman Hill, which was longlisted for our 2023 First Novel Prize. Please join me in welcoming the panelists to the stage.
Okay, Honorée, it is, we're going to throw it over to you to begin the reading.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be reading from Mr. Baldwin's first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and from a section called Florence's Prayer. Florence raised her voice in the only song she could remember that her mother used to sing. It's me, it's me, it's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Gabriel turned to stare at her in astonished triumph that his sister should at last be humbled. She did not look at him. Her thoughts were all on God. After a moment, the congregation and the piano joined her. Not my father, not my mother, but it's me, oh Lord. She knew that Gabriel rejoiced, not that her humility might lead her to grace, but only that some private anguish had brought her low. Her song revealed that she was suffering, and this her brother was glad to see. This had always been his spirit. Nothing had ever changed it, nothing ever would. For a moment, her pride stood up. The resolution that had brought her to this place tonight faltered, and she felt that if Gabriel was the Lord's anointed, she would rather die and endure hell for all eternity than bow before his altar. But she strangled her pride, rising to stand with them in the holy space before the altar and still singing, standing in the need of prayer. Kneeling as she had not knelt for many years, and in this company before the altar, she gained again from the song the meaning it had held for her mother and gained a new meaning for herself. As a child, the song had made her see a woman dressed in black, standing in infinite mist alone, waiting for the form of the Son of God to lead her through that white fire. This woman now returned to her, more desolate. It was herself. Not knowing where to put her foot, she waited, trembling, for the mist to be parted, that she might walk in peace. That long road, her life, which she had followed for 60 groaning years, had led her at last to her mother's starting place, the altar of the Lord. For her feet stood on the edge of that river which her mother, rejoicing, had crossed over. And would the Lord now reach out his hand to Florence and heal and save? But going down before the scarlet cloth at the foot of the golden cross, it came to her that she had forgotten how to pray. Her mother had taught her that the way to pray was to forget everything and everyone but Jesus, to pour out of the heart like water from a bucket, all evil thoughts, all thoughts of self, all malice for one's enemies, to come boldly and yet more humbly than a little child before the giver of all good things. Yet in Florence's heart tonight, hatred and bitterness weighed like granite. Pride refused to abdicate from the throne it had held so long. Neither love nor humility had led her to the altar, but only fear. And God did not hear the prayers of the fearful, for the hearts of the fearful held no belief. Such prayers could rise no higher than the lips that had uttered them. Around her, she heard the saints' voices, a steady, charged murmur, with now again the name of Jesus rising above, sometimes like the swift rising of a bird into the air of a sunny day, sometimes like the slow rising of the mist from swamp ground. Was this the way to pray? In the church that she had joined when she first came north, one knelt before the altar once only in the beginning to ask forgiveness of sins, and this accomplished, one was baptized and became a Christian to kneel no more thereafter. Even if the Lord should lay some great burden on one's back, as he had done, but never so heavy a burden as this she carried now, one prayed in silence. It was indecent, the practice of common niggers to cry aloud at the foot of the altar, tears streaming for all the world to see. She had never done it, not even as a girl down home in the church they had gone to in those days. Now perhaps it was too late, and the Lord would suffer her to die in the darkness in which she had lived so long. In the olden days, God had healed his children. He had caused the blind to see, the lame to walk, and he had raised dead men from the grave. But Florence remembered one phrase which she now muttered against the knuckles that bruised her lips. Lord, help my unbelief.
Yep. Okay. I'm gonna go to the podium. It's up to you. Go ahead.
I am going to read from Another Country, which was written in 1962, published in 1962. Bear with me if I falter. My vision's a little wobbly. And this is Ida Scott. She moved with a wonderful long-legged stride, and she carried her head high, as though it had borne, but only yesterday, the weight of an African water jar. Her mother's head had borne the weight of white folks' washing, and it was because Ida had never known what to make of this fact. Should she be ashamed of it or proud that there mingled in her regal beauty something of a too quick, diffident, plebeian disdain? She was working now as a waitress in a chain restaurant on the eastern edge of the village, and her confusion revealed itself in her attitude toward her customers, an attitude which was at once haughty and free. He had watched her as she crossed the floor in her checkered apron, her face a dark mask behind which belligerence battled with humility. There was in her eye, this was in her eyes, which never for an instant lost their wariness, and which were always ready within a split second to turn black and lightless with contempt. Even when she was being friendly, there was something in her manner, in her voice, which carried a warning. She was always waiting for the veiled insult or the lewd suggestion, and she had good reason for it. She was not being fantastical or perverse. It was the way the world treated girls with bad reputations, and every colored girl had been born with one. Now, as she walked beside him, trim and oddly elegant in a dark blue coat and with her head covered by an old-fashioned and rather theatrical shawl, he saw that both her vanity and her contempt were being swollen by the glances which rested on her as briefly and unforgettably as the touch of a whip. She was very, very dark. She was beautiful, and he was proud to be with her, artlessly proud, in the shining, overt male way. But the eyes they passed accused him enviously of a sniggering back alley conquest. White men looked at her, then looked at him. They looked at her as though she were no better, though more lascivious and rare, than a whore. And then the eyes of the men sought his, inviting a wet complicity. The women, too, they saw Ida first and might have been happy to admire her if she had been walking alone, but she was with Vivaldi, which gave her the status of a thief. The means that she had used to accomplish this abduction were beneath or perhaps beyond them, but their eyes briefly accused Vivaldi of betrayal, then narrowed against a dream or a nightmare and turned away. Ida strode past, seeming not to see them. She conveyed this stride in her bright, non-committal face, how far she felt them to be beneath her. She had the great advantage of being extraordinary, however she might bear this distinction, or however others might wish to deny her. Her smile suggested these people, the citizens of the world's most bewildered city, were so common that they were all but invisible. Nothing was simpler for her than to ignore or to seem to ignore these people. Nothing was farther beyond them than the possibility of ignoring her, and the disadvantage at which they thus were placed, for which, after all, they had only themselves to blame, and something which Vivaldi could scarcely believe concerning the poverty of their lives.
Hello, everyone. I'm reading from If Bill Street Could Talk. And I'm going to start with a short quote and just a little context. I'm reading an excerpt, a larger excerpt from the beginning, and then a very short excerpt at the end. The longer I live, the more deeply I learn that love, whether we call it friendship or family or romance, is the work of mirroring and magnifying each other's light. Gentle work, steadfast work, life-saving work in those moments when life and shame and sorrow occlude our own light from our view, but there is still a clear-eyed, loving person to beam it back. In our best moments, we are that person for another. James Baldwin, Nothing Personal. I look at myself in the mirror. I know that I was christened Clementine, and so it would make sense if people called me Clem, or even, come to think of it, Clementine, since that's my name. But they don't. People call me Tish. I guess that makes sense too. I'm tired, and I'm beginning to think that maybe everything that happens makes sense. Like, if it didn't make sense, how could it happen? But that's really a terrible thought. It can only come out of trouble that doesn't make sense. Today, I went to see Fani. That's not his name either. He was christened Alonzo, and it might make sense if people called him Lonnie. But no, we've always called him Fani. Alonzo Hunt, that's his name. I've known him all my life, and I hope I'll always know him. But I only call him Alonzo when I have to break down some real heavy shit to him. Today I said, Alonzo? And he looked at me, that quickening look he has when I call him by his name. He's in jail. So where we were, I was sitting on a bench in front of a board, and he was sitting on a bench in front of a board. And we were facing each other through a wall of glass between us. You can't hear anything through this glass, and so you both have a little telephone. You have to talk through that. I don't know why people always look down when they talk through a telephone, but they always do. You have to remember to look up at the person you're talking to. So when I said, Alonzo, he looked down and then he looked up and he smiled and he held the phone and he waited. I hope that nobody ever has to look at anybody they love through glass. And I didn't say it the way I meant to say it. I meant to say it in a very offhand way so he wouldn't be too upset, so he'd understand that I was saying it without any kind of accusation in my heart. And I thought too that when he got over being worried, when he was lying by himself at night, when he was all by himself in the very deepest part of himself, maybe, when he thought about it, he'd be glad. And that might help him. I said, Alonzo, we're going to have a baby. I looked at him, I know I smiled. His face looked as though it were plunging into water. I couldn't touch him. I wanted so to touch him. I smiled again and my hands got wet on the phone, and then for a moment I couldn't see him at all. And I shook my head and my face was wet, and I said, I'm glad, don't you worry, I'm glad. But he was far away from me now, all by himself. I waited for him to come back. I could see it flash across his face. My baby? I knew he would think that. I don't mean that he doubted me, but a man thinks that. And for those few seconds while he was out there by himself, away from me, the baby was the only real thing in the world. More real than the prison, more real than me. I should have said it already. We're not married. That means more to him than it does to me, but I understand how he feels. We were going to get married, but then he went to jail. Fani is 22. I am 19. Then he asked the ridiculous question, are you sure? No, I ain't sure. I'm just trying to mess with your mind. Then he grinned. He grinned because then he knew. What we gonna do? He asked me just like a little boy. Well, we ain't gonna drown it, so I guess we'll have to raise it. Fani threw back his head and laughed. He laughed till tears came down his face. So then I felt that the part that I've been so frightened of would be all right. He looked at me, then he looked down. What you gonna do for real? I'm gonna do just like I've been doing. I'll work up to just about the last month, and then Mama and Sis will take care of me. You don't gotta worry. And anyway, we have you out of here before then. You sure about that? He said with his little smile. Of course I'm sure about that. I'm always sure about that. I knew what he was thinking, but I can't let myself think about it, not now, watching him. I must be sure. And then this is from the end. The baby was restless, and I was scared. It was almost time. I was so tired, I almost wanted to die. For a long time, because he was in solitary, I had not been able to see Fonny. I had seen him on this day. He was so skinny, he was so bruised, I almost cried out. To whom? Where? I saw this question in Fonny's enormous slanted black eyes, eyes that burned now like the eyes of a prophet. Yet when he grinned, I saw all over again my lover, as though for the first time. We sat and we just looked at each other. We were making love to each other through all that glass and stone and steel. From my chair, I looked out my window over these dreadful streets. The baby asked, "Is there not one righteous among them?" And kicked, but with a tremendous difference, and I knew that my time was almost on me. I remember that I looked at my watch. It was 20 to 8. I was alone, but I knew that someone soon would be coming through the door. The baby kicked again, and I caught my breath, and I almost cried, and the phone rang.
Good evening, everybody. I'm reading from James Baldwin's last novel, Just Above My Head, which incidentally was published the year I was born, 1978. I'm reading from a section about one of the characters named Julia, who is a child preacher. She's given that up, and she's about 14 years old. And she's coming from a movie date with a guy named Arthur. Sometimes, now that I'm out of the pulpit, I feel more in the pulpit than I did when I was preaching. How come? He asked. I don't know, she said. Maybe I see the people better than I did. Maybe I see myself. When I was preaching, I don't think I knew what I was saying. I didn't know what it meant. But now it comes back to me. I hear myself again, but really for the first time. She was walking with her hands in her pockets. I didn't know it was true. How could you preach it if you didn't know it was true? Oh, I believed it, but I didn't know. And now maybe I don't believe it, but I'm beginning to know. She looked at him and smiled. I know that sounds crazy. Maybe, he said after a moment. When I preached about how the Lord, he can cause your soul to tremble, I didn't know that was true. Julia, how did you? He did not know how to phrase his question. He had been about to ask, what made you change? But he no longer believed, as he only had a short time ago, that she had changed. This wonder tongue tied him. It frightened him, and he could not ask, what happened to you? He was not sure he could not bear the answer, even if she could bear to utter it. And I'm skipping ahead to when she invites him up to her apartment that she shares with her father. Her mother has died, and her father has been molesting her since around the time that she quit preaching. She unlocked the apartment door very quietly, switched on the light, and they stepped inside. Her father's voice came from the living room. Hey, Julia, where have you been? Arthur felt Julia suck her breath in sharply before she could answer, and before they could reach the living room, Joel appeared. He was wearing pajamas, carelessly, appallingly open. He was drunk, and he rushed toward Julia. I came home early especially for you. I don't never see you no more. Where have you been? Daddy, Julia said, just to the movies with Arthur. Arthur brought me home. He had seen only Julia. He had not seen Arthur. Julia's words checked him. He stopped and looked at Arthur. Arthur had wanted to get to the bathroom and pee. Joel's look froze his pee inside him, froze everything inside him. Who are you? What are you doing here with my daughter? He turned to Julia. You dragging them off the streets now? Daddy, Julia said, this is Arthur. You know him. You know him from when he was little. The hell you say? He damn sure ain't little now. What you doing coming in here this time of night with my daughter? I don't want her fooling around with black scum like you. She got her daddy to look out for her. Arthur said, you know me, Brother Miller. You know my whole family, my father, my mother, my brother Hall. I'm Paul Montana's son. These credentials, as Joel stood leaning in the passageway, seemed slowly to penetrate his brain. He said, Paul Montana, the piano player? That's right, I'm his youngest son. Julie and me, we just went to the movies and I walked her home, that's all. Joel's lips slowly came together. His eyes changed, cleared, focused, and he saw Arthur. When he saw Arthur, he saw something else, his nakedness. He straightened, tried to close his pajamas. He said to Julia, you should have said something, daughter. You didn't give me time, Daddy. She was looking at him with pity and from very far away. Joel looked at Arthur again, and what Arthur now saw in his eyes was harder to bear than the hatred of a short time before. A short time before, seconds before, the eyes had been alive with hatred, as brilliant and black as coal. Now they were lifeless and dead with terror. Seconds before, his voice had shaken the walls and menaced the neighborhood sleep. Now his voice was a cracked, dry whisper. How's your father? He managed. Ain't seen him in a long while. That's why I didn't recognize you. He tried to smile. You have to forgive me, son. These been some trying days since my wife passed. I ain't over it yet. He looked at Julia, and strangely, life flickered again in his eyes. And incredibly, for that second, Arthur was very moved by the man. He looked again at Arthur. I've been almost crazy worrying about my daughter, now that she ain't got no mother. He tried to smile, tried to put it all behind him. Can't blame a man for wanting to protect his only daughter. She's all I got. He turned to Julia. Take Arthur in the living room, daughter. Give him something to drink. I was just getting ready to go to bed. He smiled at Arthur. No sense in trying to keep up with you young folks. Astoundingly, abruptly sober, he extended his hand to Arthur. Forgive me, son. I was just trying to protect my daughter. No hard feelings. Arthur shook his head. No, sir, no hard feelings. Joel started up the staircase. Good night, daughter. See you in the morning. Joel disappeared up the stairs. They remained where they had left him, like two frightened children, Arthur fighting back a terrifying impulse to crack up with laughter. Can I go pee now? He asked Julia. They looked at each other a moment, and then Julia laughed. They laughed together, low, bewildered, frightened laughter, like children not wishing to be heard laughing. They heard Joel upstairs. Julia said, You better before you cause a scandal. And they laughed again until Arthur was afraid he might really pee in his pants. Hurry up, said Julia. Come on, I'll see what we got to drink. By the time he came back, Julia had poured him a beer, and he no longer felt like laughing. Girl, he said, sitting beside her on the sofa and picking up his beer, what you gonna do? She said, not looking at him, can't say. I really can't say. Then, not looking at him, her arms folded, don't talk to nobody about my daddy, what you saw and heard tonight. I know you won't. I'm gonna find a way to do what I have to do. Then she looked at him with a look so candid that he wondered what she knew. You're gonna have to do the same thing, one way or the other, you know? We all do. Sometimes I think, maybe my daddy, he never found that out. But one thing I can tell you, and she turned away from him, leaning forward, her hands on her knees. He saw again the great difference, the distance between her eyes and her father's eyes. Julia ain't dead. Julia far from dead.
to actually watch a clip of the conversation from 1971 between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni. And this short clip, after we've actually watched it, I have a not so softball question for our authors. So if you would run the clip, please.
The black male situation of the black male is in microcosm the situation of the Christian world. The price of being a black man in America. God bless you.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
It's the weather.
The price you had to pay, the price you're expected to pay, and which you have to outwit, is your sex. No, a black man is forbidden by definition, since he's black, to assume the roles, the burdens, the duties, and the joys of being a man. In the same way that my child produced in your body did not belong to me, but to the master. He could be sold at any moment.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
I can follow that.
And this erodes a man's sexuality. When you erode a man's sexuality, you destroy his possibility to love anybody. You know, though sex and love are not the same thing, if the man's sexuality is gone, then his possibility, his hope of loving is also gone. You know,
He has no way to express. He has limited ways to express.
He has absolutely no floor on which to dance, no room in which to move, no way to get from one day to the next. Because to make love to you is not the same thing as taking you. You know, and it's a journey which most people have got to make with each other.
But why do black men? Why do we allow this to happen?
Look, when I begin to talk about, the situation of black men, I mean, I'm nearly 50, so that I've got to avoid sounding, in any way defensive, because
No,
I don't mean that I think that you're attacking me, but you asked me a question which I'm trying to answer as honestly as I can. I have to look back over my own life, and you save yourself if you have any sense at all, and if you're lucky enough. If you lose your center, and let's say the center is your sex, if you lose that, if you allow that to be destroyed, then everything else is gone. And you have to figure out a way of saving it from the landlord. Because after all, I had to watch my father and what my father had to endure to raise 9 children on $27.50 a week when he was working. Now, when I was a kid, I didn't know what the man was going through at all. I didn't know why he was always in a rage. I didn't know why he was impossible to live with. But I had not had to go through yet his working day. And he couldn't quit his job because he had the kids to feed. He couldn't say, as our kids can, I don't like white people. He couldn't say anything. He lived his whole life in silence except in the church. And he couldn't explain, how can you explain to a 5-year-old kid, my boss, called me a nigger and I quit. And the kid's belly's empty and you see it. And you gotta raise the kid. You got to raise the kid. And your manhood is being slowly destroyed hour by hour, day by day. Your woman's watching it. You're watching her watch it. And the love that you have for each other is being to be destroyed hour by hour and day by day. It's not her fault, it's not your fault, but there it goes because the pressures under which you live are inhuman. My father finally went mad. And I understood when I became a man how that could happen. It wasn't that he didn't love us, he loved us. It wasn't that he didn't love his wife, our mother. He loved her. But he couldn't take it. Day after day and hour after hour, being treated like a nigger. on that job and in those streets and on those subways, and then coming home to his children who didn't understand him at all, who were moving further and further away from him because they were afraid of him, and also, which is even worse, afraid of the situation, the condition, which he represented. He was, after all, for a kid, you begin to see when you're called a nigger, you look at your father because you think your father can rule the world. Every kid thinks that, you know, and your father cannot do anything about it. And then you begin to despise your father and you realize, oh, that's what a nigger is. And it's not your father's fault. And it's not your fault. It's the fault of the power, people who hold the power, because they had deliberately trained your father to be a slave. And they deliberately calculated that if he is a slave, you will be a slave. You will also accept it. And it'll go on forever, and slavery will last 1,000 years, which slaveholders said and believed. And now the bill is in. And they want from me, or from you, sympathy and understanding. I understand it all too well. And I have all the sympathy in the world for that spiritual disaster. But I have no pity. The bill is in. We paid it. Now it's your turn.
It's like a funny situation to be in, because like we were poor, but maybe unfortunately for somebody like me, not poor enough to relate to it. In that, you know, we had enough to eat it like that, things like that. So that my relationship to that whole syndrome, which remains true, I'm 28, to this day, is that I really don't understand it. I don't understand how one hand, you say you're talking about like a black man, that he can be nothing in the streets and so fearful in his home, that he can be brutalized by some white person somewhere, and then come home and treat, you know, I mean, me, my mother, the same way that he was being treated, which perpetuates. I mean, you take somebody like me. I'm not married, right?
Yes, but Nikki,
I couldn't play my mother.
Yes, I know.
You know what I mean? I just couldn't deal with it. I said, no, this won't work.
But Nikki, it is also true that since your mother played that role, you haven't got to.
I couldn't.
But you haven't got to. That's the point. Because she did.
But her mother did.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
Yes, but that's how we got here. What I really am trying to say is I don't want us to underestimate the price paid for us.
I have a great deal of respect for those people, for my parents, for people that I don't know, for the whole, you know, everybody who's shuffled. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's a phenomenon to me how you could be mistreated and then come home and mistreat someone the same way in order to...
Well, first of all, Nikki, you say mistreated, or I say mistreated. No. But in the mind of the person who is doing it, he's not mistreating you.
Well, I'm not dealing with that.
Well,
I'm not going to even, I mean, let's not for a minute. Let's say in the mind of, let's say your father, who is just an example, or the mind of my father, you know what I mean? He is being mistreated. I'm not going to deal with the cracker that's mistreating him. I'm going to deal with him. He knows that he is not being treated with the respect due him as a person, as a black man. Okay. In order to like get that together, when he comes into that house, he begins to like brutalize my mother, for example. You see what I mean? Which becomes like a phenomenon to me, because I don't like white people and I'm afraid of black men, right? If you could follow what I'm saying without anybody writing a letter and saying sister, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but you can...
Okay, so what do you do?
Listen, you have to, I think
it's a cycle.
Of course it is, but you see, this is one of the reasons I don't protest, but try to make clear that the words white and black don't mean.
Okay. So, wanted to show that clip because it's a very dynamic conversation that is happening between Giovanni and Baldwin that I think situates us in a conversation that's happening between black women and black men. And in the context of what we're discussing today and the readings that these authors have just shared with you, my question is, how do we read Baldwin's characterization of black women in the context of this conversation with Giovanni, where they seem to be going like this, and Baldwin is not empathic or understanding what Giovanni is saying about the perpetuation of the brutality that the Black man experiences, that he then brings home to the Black woman. So I would say, Honore, if you would like to actually do the honors.
Oh my goodness.
I told you, no softball questions.
And I love the way that you actually pronounce my name. I wish I could pronounce it that way. I think that one of the things that I see, I've of course, have seen this clip. You know, I'm probably the oldest person on the panel, so I've seen this clip many, many times. I think what's going on that I find really interesting under the surface of this, and then I'm going to quickly move to what's going on, is that these are two queer people. Mm-hmm. And neither one of them are discussing their queerness. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that what Ms. Giovanni is talking about, and what Mr. Baldwin is talking about in terms of Black men and whatever, is that both of them are blaming what Black men do on white people. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think for me, having, you know, I mean, this is like nearly 50 years ago, or maybe even 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we have a different, hopefully, vocabulary and a different experience. And what we know is that Black men are not children, they are grown. And we cannot blame brutality on someone else. What I do think that's interesting, and this predates, you know, Bell Hooks's discussion on white supremacist patriarchy, is that they're both sort of talking about this desire of Black men to inhabit a patriarchy that white people created in this world. And so when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at neither one of them are really talking about what appears in Mr. Baldwin's work, mm-hmm. which is the vulnerability of Black men, mm-hmm. right? They're talking to an audience that isn't there in the room, but that's the audience. And the audience is the Black arts movement with its super toxic, hyper masculinity. Some of these people who later, you know, worshiped Mr. Baldwin, called him homophobic names. So there's all of this sort of stuff happening that's bubbling. And that's why they're doing this, because they're not really having a real conversation about what's going on. They're just sort of recycling the tropes. The Black man, you know, the white man. But I find it extraordinary that they're even trying. I mean, even though the conversation was clearly a failure, but they're trying, they're trying to have, you know, this conversation and trying to find the vocabulary. Mm-hmm. You know,
yeah,
which helps us. Of course, again, I'm the oldest person here, but it helps us try to find our own vocabulary. You know, mm-hmm. in their wake. Yeah. I don't know if I answered that question.
Yes, but, yes, thank you.
But I did my best.
But it sparked something, and I'll ask you, Regina, to respond to this. In that time, could they have found that vocabulary?
I don't know. When I'm watching it, I see a large generational difference, and my heart goes out a little to both of them because of the divide between having to be representational, like he's asking, he is sort of being put on the spot to answer a question that there's no easy answer to. for me, it's two people talking about freedom against the backdrop of systemic freedom, and also, yes, avoiding the issue of their queerness, but it's there in the room and it's framed around masculinity and race, which is what is sometimes easiest to have a conversation about, but hard to have a conversation about honestly, usually. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes. And I also think I listen to that conversation and I hear Lorraine Hansberry, who is also queer, and Baldwin's a good friend of Baldwin's, and her idea of and it seems an old-fashioned idea now of, if you're going to judge someone, you have to stand in their shoes, right? I think one of her characters says, in his shoes, and take the whole of the man, and that's a generational uh, um, take on masculinity. That does sort of put uh, black women in the background. But I guess these conversations, they're really kind of challenging for me because I think everything blurs. So I see them trying to find a common language and sort of just missing one another.
Yeah.
Right?
So I will ask you, Kim, in light of the piece that you read and the character's experience of abuse from her father, that's a prime example of what Giovanni would say is that perpetuation of the emasculation and abuse that a black man experiences, and therefore it carries on into the home. Please.
What year was that, by the way?
1971.
Okay. So this is 1978, and I think by then Baldwin had indeed put himself more in the shoes of a woman. Because this book I read when I was the tender age of, I think, about 24, 23, 24 years old. And after all the, and it's a thick book. It's like, but after all these years, the only character, and I realized, I was like, oh, it's not narrated by her? What? It's narrated by a male character, and it focuses on the friendship between, I think, these three people. Two are men, or maybe even three are men, and one's a woman, and I only remember the woman. I remember Julia. That's the only thing I remember about this book, Julia. And I started to skim through, and I was like, well, why is this character? And I think for me, because this character is someone who transforms herself multiple times. She takes back her power, even though the power is taken from her, not only by her father, but I think by her community. She was a child preacher, which she says she had this kind of revelatory experience where she goes into preaching, which James Baldwin himself was a child preacher, right? That he at some point gave up, right? So I think for me, to see her be able to embody so many different identities that she herself chooses. She even becomes a prostitute at some point, right? And she does it to actually support her younger brother, but then she moves on from that. She goes to Africa, right? She becomes the lover of a chief in her first stardom, a chief in Africa. But even after that, she becomes a model, and she comes home. So for me, she's just a very dynamic character. And even in the scene that I read, I chose it because this is the moment when she actually stands up to her father by bringing a boy home. She knows what that's going to do to her father.
Do you think that the characterization of Julia in the novel is some sort of atonement that James Baldwin is issuing or wishing to receive, given the perspective that he had and maybe still had as he was having the conversation that he had during the conversation with Giovanni?
I'm going to say that it could be. It could be, especially given that conversation. But as I was telling you before, when you mentioned the clip, I was saying, oh, I just read that. I just read a transcript of that. And I was like, actually, no, that wasn't Nikki. That was Audre Lorde. You know, where he had another interview with Audre Lorde and was discussing kind of the same type of thing. I don't know what year that was from. That might have been, that might have been
after.
80s.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I really can't say, because I think, you know, what also might be going on is that sometimes, you know, this is a work of fiction, right? Even though it's based in reality, and I don't know the years of, you know, these books, because I have read Another Country. I have read If Beale Street Could Talk. In fact, If Beale Street Could Talk, I was like, I felt he kind of nailed this young woman's voice, right? And I was like, oh wow, this I forget that this is a man and a gay man writing this young woman's voice.
We're going to go back to that, trust me. I have a little something to say about that.
But I have to say, I think maybe sometimes also what happens is this kind of separation between yourself and the art, you know, so that you can, on one respect, yes, literally embody the shoes of people who are not like you, but at the same time, you're you at the end of the day, right? And I think sometimes there's this kind of even disconnect where you can put yourself out there and you can put all these emotions, maybe sometimes that are blocked within you. And I've had writer friends where I've experienced this. It's like, oh, well, this is a persona. And I'm just like, but that's so beautiful and emotional and vibrant, and then you can't even talk about emotions. Right? So I think maybe there could be also some of that going on.
So I deliberately left you for last to get your response to the conversation, specifically as you read from If Beale Street Could Talk, and the protagonist, as well as the narrator, is a woman. And, you know, Kim, I will argue that...
It's been a while.
I would argue, or I would ask you, Shayla, what do you make of the Tish's voice?
Yeah, it's interesting because, Kim, you just kind of said that there is a kind of, it seems like Baldwin's women characters kind of transform a long time. And so by the time we get to Tish, we do get, maybe not a perfect, you know, voice, but we do get this voice that is somehow very assured and certain amongst circumstances that are impossibly uncertain. And so what I find interesting is that there is, you know, a lot of times it could be, you know, Black women are supposed to be strong or have this like front of armor, right? Even in a situation like this, where of course the father of Tish's child, which she's about to have, is falsely imprisoned. And so there could be like this armor to the voice, but there's a softness, right? We start at a softness and we go other places. And so for me, what I was really taken by with this character is... what I was really taken by with this character is that, and the reason also that I read that quote is because of this idea of light, right? And so what I feel, I want to also kind of go back to that conversation between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin, which is what I feel like is getting, you asked like what's getting lost there? Something I feel like that's getting lost is that protection and like preservation of the self can happen or needs to happen simultaneously. And so they're kind of crossing wires where it's like, this has to happen or this has to happen, but what about them both happening together? And I feel like that's the only way we survive, if they're both happening together. And so what I think about with the quote that I read from Baldwin to start it off is this light that he's talking about in Nothing Personal, which is like you have to mirror the light of the person you love in order for them to see it when they are, say if they're incarcerated behind walls and they cannot physically even see that or feel that or know what's to come. But I think when I was thinking about it, you also, and I think this is what Tish, the voice of Tish, it comes across in the novel, you also have to hold tight to your own light and find your own light. And so to me, the only way that Fonnie survives, the only way that the baby survives, that Tish survives, is that she is kind of mirroring this light back to herself when her partner cannot do that. And so that makes me think about perhaps, a missing element to that conversation is like, what does it mean to hold tight to that? To give to another, but also to hold tight to yourself, to preserve that. So that's what I think about when I hear her voice.
Brilliant, brilliant. So Kim, it's interesting that you said that Baldwin seems to capture the voice of a woman character, a young woman's character, because I actually found something a bit different, especially in If Beale Street Could Talk. And I'm just going to read very quickly, because this passage sounds very, very male-centered and sounds like Baldwin or a black man speaking through a 19-year-old girl who is far more composed than I would have expected. Now, this is Tish speaking. He was a stranger to me, but joined. I had never seen him with other men. I had never seen the love and respect that men can have for each other. I've had a time since to think about it. I think that the first time a woman sees this, though I was not yet a woman, she sees it, first of all, only because she loves the man. She could not possibly see it otherwise. It can be a very great revelation. And in this fucked up time and place, many women, perhaps most women, feel in this warmth and energy a threat. They think that they feel locked out. The truth is that they sense themselves in the presence, so to speak, of a language which they cannot decipher and therefore cannot manipulate. And however they make a thing about it, so far from being locked out, are appalled by the apprehension that they are, in fact, forever locked in. Only a man can see in the face of a woman the girl she was. It is a secret which can be revealed only to a particular man, and then only at his insistence. But men have no secrets, except from women, and never grow up in the way that women do. It is very much harder, and it takes much longer for a man to grow up, and he could never do it at all without women. This is a mystery which can terrify and immobilize a woman, and it is always the key to her deepest distress. She must watch and guide, but he must lead, and he will always appear to be giving far more of his real attention to his comrades than he is giving to her. But that noisy outward openness of men with each other enables them to deal with the silence and secrecy of women. That silence and secrecy which contains the truth of a man and releases it. I suppose that at the root of the resentment, a resentment which hides bottomless terror, has to do with the fact that a woman is tremendously controlled by what the man's imagination makes of her, literally, hour by hour, day by day. So she becomes a woman. But a man exists in his own imagination and can never be at the mercy of a woman's. Anyway, in this fucked up time and place, the whole thing becomes ridiculous when you realize that women are supposed to be more imaginative than men. This is an idea dreamed up by men, and it proves exactly the contrary. The truth is that dealing with the reality of men leaves a woman very little time or need for imagination. And you can get very fucked up here once you take seriously the notion that a man who is not afraid to trust his imagination, which is all that men have ever trusted, is effeminate. It says a lot about this country because, of course, if all you want to do is make money, the very last thing you need is imagination, or women for that matter, or men. So this sounds very, very, this sounds more like a man talking about a woman talking about a man.
Can I just clarify?
Absolutely.
That ain't on my favorite shelf. This one is.
Okay.
Even just skimming again this 600 page book, there are lots of long speeches that his characters make. And I think, and I was seeing even some of the criticism that was written about this particular book, which I adored when I was 24, but there's also really graphic sex scenes in this book, which I was like, no wonder I like this.
In Field Street, too.
And one of the critiques was that, James Baldwin can be heavy-handed, using his characters as a mouthpiece for himself, and I definitely saw this where like there's these speeches that go on and on and on, and I think he's best, when he's having just those solid interactions, and I probably am guilty of this as myself as a writer, but hey, but when he's having those solid interactions between people, so that's all.
That's what you'll say. Okay, all right, fair enough.
Clear my name.
It is clear. It is cleared. So my next question is really going to ask you to think about women characters, Black women characters, from the texts of Black women in this particular era of Baldwin's writing. Now, my dissertation, written very long ago, actually speaks about how Black women writers seem to be engaged in the act of revising and reviving, breathing life into women characters from Black male canonical texts that didn't necessarily center their narratives. So if you think about a Black woman girl character from one of Baldwin's texts, or the text of any Black male writer of that period, is there a particular woman character, female character, who seems to have been revised by, let's say, a Morrison or Alice Walker, Naylor, Zora Neale Hurston, for that matter, Lorraine Hansberry, going back to that time. Honoré, would you do the honors? Literally.
Well, when I'm thinking about Baldwin's work, and I'm thinking about other Black women of his time, Toni K. Bambara, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker. What I'm seeing is an issue that pops up a lot today, which is that Black writers are assumed that they're writing archetypes of Black people. And so the characters represent, supposedly, Blackness, Black masculinity, Black femininity, et cetera, et cetera. As a radical Black feminist, what I'm looking at when I look at these Black women writers is that they're attempting to change conversations nationally through their books, except for Toni Morrison. And one of the things about Toni Morrison that a lot of people don't really seem to be aware of is that Toni Morrison did not identify as a feminist. And she specifically said, I am not a feminist. But when you look at someone like Alice Walker, she's attempting to, as a stated feminist, and it always sort of makes me chuckle whenever I hear Black women say, I'm trying to choose my words here.
Come on now.
Foolish things, the foolish thing. I'm a womanist, but I'm not a feminist, which indicates to me they have not read Alice Walker's definition of womanism, which says that you have to be a feminist to be a womanist. So there are all these sort of conversations happening that are really putting a lot of pressure on the art. As someone who is the child, I had a very fraught childhood, but still the child of a major Black arts movement poet, I remember these conversations. I remember these constant conversations about, you know, um, should Black women be feminists, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what's really interesting when I'm looking at Baldwin's work, and kind of juxtaposing it with the women that, I mean, he was tight with Alice Walker, he was tight with Toni Morrison, he was tight with Angela Davis, and I'm looking at his work. What I'm looking at is that he is grappling with this idea of manhood that is supposed to be him, even as a queer man. He cannot, in terms of these very um, narrow homophobic attitudes, he cannot be a real Black man, whatever that means. And so I see the same thing with Black women that he was friendly with, that he corresponded with. They are grappling with the notion of Black womanhood, that we should all be strong, that we should all, put community first, and so on and so forth. So I'm not really I'm not really sure I'm trying to like connect, the Black women of that time to his work, but I feel like when I look at that long kind of confusing passage that you read,
It wasn't that long.
Who was supposed to be 19 years old, right? Like, a French existentialist.
Right.
Do all of this, right? What I'm seeing is I see those same sort of sociological moments in The Color Purple, even though they're in condensed form.
Yes.
But I see, like, I think about when Miss Alice wrote, when she was saying, when Celie was talking about being beaten by Mister, and she says, I make myself wood. I'm sure I'm quoting wrong, but I make myself wood. I make myself, and then she ends with, that's how I know trees fear man. Right? So there are all these sort of philosophical moments where people are trying to, this is what I'm trying to say, grapple with the human condition, grapple with the gender politics in Black America in real time with their characters, and they're a little clunky sometimes. Of course, not in The Color Purple. The Color Purple to me is
flawless.
There would be no my fiction without The Color Purple, right?
Right.
But when I'm looking at that, that's what they're trying to do. They are trying to grapple with these things that are happening in real life and make I'm thinking about James Baldwin's creation, if I'm not getting this wrong. Make me a man and make me a woman. I could be wrong. It could be another poem I'm quoting for, but that's what's going on. They're trying to cisgender, of course. I think that also needs to be said.
Absolutely.
They're trying to refashion Black manhood, refashion Black womanhood through these texts. And that's why it's a little clunky.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a long speech. I know this is heresy, but you have that, these sort of long things happening in Song of Solomon, by Toni Morrison, because they're thinking about these things. And I look at it as very Russian. Although we have our own, African philosophy, right? This is what I'm thinking, that these are these kind of Africanist philosophical moments. And that's why it's a little awkward to us.
Yes, yes. So in the little bit of time we have left, I'd like to allow the three of you to respond as well. Women characters in Baldwin potentially being revised or spoken about by Black women writers.
Well, I think first off, for me, it's important to say that Baldwin was hemmed in by bias based on his sexuality and based on history. And so I see the progression in, say, something, a book like Sula, which masterfully deals with sexuality and friendships and community in a very personal way that is not representational. And I think that's his gift to Morrison, who then gives a gift to us. And I think what she is trying and what he was trying to say, I don't know. I love Baldwin. I feel a little.
It's critique, not criticism.
I know.
And you're not speaking ill of the dead.
No, but I do. Because I feel like these writers who came before with their flaws, they wrote in order for us to have. They opened the door for us to have freedom, and for us to be able to transcend. And I see in his work how he's dealing with really complicated issues of sexuality and identity, bisexuality, but hitting the wall of racism. And I would give Toni Morrison's Sula is a wonderful example of a progression that is a feminist work, even if she did not identify as a feminist. It's one of the great feminist works, I would say. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned, it's kind of, I feel like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison are in conversation so much. So it's easy to kind of think of them in conversation. And when I picked If Beale Street Could Talk, it's one of my favorite works by Baldwin. But I was thinking a lot about Toni Morrison's jazz. And I'm thinking about this kind of idea that's been coming up as we're all talking of like this, it's a kind of thinking about humanity, humankind, human nature, but in a kind of theorizing that I think a lot of, even especially now, perhaps Black writers don't get credit for. If we think about like autofiction or theoretical fiction, with like that being in the actual text, and it's almost done so brilliantly that it's just like the craft of the writing for Baldwin and for Morrison. And so I think about jazz because we get this main character who is, and so there's one sense of like the style of jazz, right? There's the style of the novel, it's just everything is going and going, but it's also allowing a Black woman to just be, and all of these kind of theories to come up in her actions, in her movements, and she's figuring out her existence, and we're figuring out her existence. And if you've read jazz, other people are figuring out what's going on too. What's going on in that. So I think about jazz as kind of kindred in that way.
Kim, it looks like you've got a rebuttal.
Well, I'm just going to say that, I can think of The Color Purple because, especially, like I said, with this particular character, she's a child, her father's molesting her, so I immediately think of The Color Purple. I immediately think of even Push, going years later, but I have not read them also recently, so I can't say, because I might go back and read and say, actually,
maybe not.
Right? But I'm gonna flip a little bit and talk about the other male writers at this time period.
Sure.
And I want to talk about John A. Williams and The Man Who Cried I Am, which is also on my favorite shelf. I want to talk about John O'Killens and Then We Heard the Thunder. I want to talk about Sam Greenlee and The Spook Who Sat by the Door, also on my favorite shelf. But at a certain point, I had to stop reading Black male writers of that time period because these are the only representations I saw of Black women in these books. Gold diggers, prostitutes. It was just like, okay, can I get a Black woman who's just down to earth? Or, they were working for their man, fighting for their man. I was like, talk about tropes and stereotypes, right? And so I felt that at least with Baldwin, yes, we have these problematic passages, but I felt that I was getting a more three-dimensional view of Black women, as flawed as they might have been. And then I just wanted to share a brief excerpt. I never forgot this.
Okay.
I just remember the word ceilings after 20-something years. And this is when Julia was a prostitute, making money, like I said, to help her brother. I was looking at ceilings, she told me much later, while men pounded themselves into her, less brutally after all than her father had. And she picked up the money and took it home and put it aside. She had taken it all on. She had taken on too much. So I had said, and so I was to say again, until my heart was broken. But in the meantime, there was Jimmy, her brother, et cetera, et cetera. And I never forgot that passage because it just personalized that experience of a woman.
Right. Brilliant. Well, thank you so very much for this wonderful conversation, and I'm so sorry that it has to end. And I would love to have a conversation just about Morrison and Baldwin, to be honest. But that would also take probably 3-4, a full day, if we could. But I do thank all of you for this wonderful conversation, and maybe someday some of our progeny will be actually watching this conversation and critiquing, not criticizing, our assessments and evaluations and perspectives. So very, very thank you to all of you also as our audience for coming, and I hope that you got a lot out of this conversation.
Nothing further to say other than just thank you all so much for being here tonight. What a wonderful part of the celebration. And everybody, let it continue, have conversation, enjoy the space, enjoy the bookstore, and enjoy each other. Thank you. Good night.